What kind of people look at a raging North Atlantic storm, winds screaming like living things, rain striking the earth like thrown stones, and decide they can build a home that will not fall, using no nails, no cement, and no mercy from the weather? The storm comes first. It always does. Before history remembers names, before sagas turn men into legends, there is the sound of wind tearing across open land, the sky collapsing into rain, the sea rising like an enemy with no face. In the far north, storms do not knock. They arrive with violence, stripping heat from the air, ripping roofs from careless shelters, and punishing every mistake without hesitation. To live here was not a choice made lightly. It was a gamble against nature itself, one that most people, even today, would refuse to take. And yet, more than 1,000 years ago, families stood in this hostile world and made a decision that still defies logic. They would not flee south. They would not build weak shelters and pray. They would build houses meant to survive storms that could shatter ships and flatten forests, houses that could bend without breaking, houses that could endure generations of winter. And they would do it without iron nails to hold the walls together, without cement to glue stone to stone. Only knowledge, patience, and an almost frightening understanding of the land. The Vikings did not see storms as accidents. They saw them as tests. Every gust of wind carried a question: are you worthy to stay? Every winter answered brutally. A poorly built home meant sickness, hunger, death. Children froze silently in the night. Roofs collapsed under snow so heavy it crushed the careless. Fire smoke trapped inside killed as surely as the cold outside. Survival demanded more than strength, it demanded intelligence sharpened by fear. What makes this story unsettling is not that the Vikings endured storms. Many people endure hardship. What unsettles us is how deliberately they prepared for it. Their homes were not improvised shelters thrown together in desperation. They were carefully engineered responses to an environment that wanted them gone. Every beam, every stone, every layer of earth served a purpose. Nothing was decorative. Nothing was wasted. These houses were arguments made against the storm itself. To understand how they did it, you must first understand what they were up against. The Scandinavian climate was and remains merciless. Winter winds could howl for days without pause. Rain came sideways, driven by gales strong enough to find the smallest weakness in a wall. Temperatures dropped fast and without warning. Wood swelled with moisture, then shrank and cracked when frozen. Stone fractured. Soil shifted. Any rigid structure that refused to move with the land eventually broke apart. Modern buildings fight storms by resisting them, by standing stiff and unmoving. The Vikings chose a different philosophy. They learned that survival did not come from defiance, but from cooperation. Their houses would not challenge the storm head-on. They would absorb it, redirect it, let it pass over and around them like water over a rock. This understanding was not written in books. It was paid for with lives. Imagine a generation before these techniques were perfected. Imagine families watching their roofs tear away in the night, hearing the terrifying crack of timbers failing, feeling the cold rush in like a living creature. Imagine learning, the hard way, that nails rust, snap, or pull loose under stress. That rigid joints become weak points. That stone walls mortared together crumble when the ground beneath them shifts. Each disaster taught a lesson. Each winter refined a method. Over time, these lessons became traditions passed down not as theories, but as rules carved into memory. Build this way, or the storm will take you. The Viking longhouse, the most iconic of their dwellings, was not just a place to sleep. It was a fortress against the elements. From the outside, it appeared humble, even primitive, low to the ground, with thick walls and a heavy roof. But humility was part of the strategy. A low profile gave the wind less to grab. Thick walls stored heat like a living thing, releasing it slowly through the night. The shape itself was a weapon, designed to confuse and weaken the storm's force. Nothing about these homes was accidental. The absence of nails was not a limitation, it was an advantage. Iron was precious, difficult to produce, and prone to corrosion in damp, salty air. A rusted nail could silently fail long before anyone noticed. Instead, Viking builders relied on joinery so precise it feels almost modern. Beams were carved to lock into each other, fitted so tightly that movement strengthened the structure rather than weakening it. When the wind pushed, the house responded not with resistance, but with flexibility. This is the first great secret of Viking stormproof houses: they were built to move. Where modern eyes see weakness in flexibility, Viking builders saw survival. Wood that could shift slightly under pressure did not crack. Joints that could tighten when stressed became stronger during storms. The house behaved less like a rigid box and more like a living organism, adjusting constantly to the forces acting upon it. Stone, too, was used differently. Instead of tall, exposed walls that invited collapse, stones were often stacked low and thick, supported by earth rather than cement. Turf, yes, earth itself became part of the architecture. Layers of soil and grass were piled onto roofs and walls, adding weight that anchored the structure while providing insulation so effective that warmth lingered even during brutal cold. To step inside one of these houses was to enter a different world. Outside, the wind screamed. Inside, the air was still, heavy with warmth and smoke. Fire burned at the center, its heat absorbed by stone and earth, radiating slowly through the night. This was not comfort in the modern sense. It was survival engineered with ruthless efficiency. But here is where the story grows darker. These houses were not built by peaceful craftsmen working leisurely under blue skies. They were built by people who knew that failure meant death. Time was limited. Resources were scarce. Mistakes were unforgiving.
And the
Every
shadows
decision
deepen.
where to place the house, how deep to dig, how to angle the roof was made with the awareness that nature would test it mercilessly. Placement alone could determine life or death. Build too high, and the wind would tear at the roof endlessly. Build too low, and melting snow would flood the floor. The Vikings learned to read the land like a warning system. Subtle slopes, natural wind breaks, the way snow drifted after storms, these were clues. The earth itself told them where survival was possible. This knowledge was not mystical. It was observational, precise, and brutally practical. And it created homes that outlasted generations, some of whose foundations still exist today, long after storms have erased weaker structures without a trace. As you listen to this story, something uncomfortable begins to surface. These people, often remembered only as raiders and warriors, possessed a level of environmental intelligence that feels almost lost today. They built without blueprints, without machines, without modern materials, yet achieved durability that challenges modern construction. The storm did not defeat them easily. But this is only the beginning. Because knowing that the Vikings built stormproof houses is far less disturbing than understanding how deeply they understood the forces trying to destroy them and how every part of their homes was designed in response to fear, memory, and the certainty that winter was coming again. And it always came again. If storms were the enemy, then Viking houses were war plans carved into wood and earth. The Vikings did not begin construction by cutting timber or stacking stone. They began by watching. Days. Weeks. Sometimes seasons passed before the first tool touched the ground. They observed how wind moved across the land, where snow gathered thickest, how rainwater carved invisible paths through soil. To an outsider, it looked like hesitation. In truth, it was reconnaissance. Because in the north, building a house without understanding the storm was the same as building a grave. The first mistake most people make is assuming a house should stand against the wind. The Vikings learned early that this instinct was wrong. Wind does not fight fairly. It searches for leverage. It slips under edges, pries apart joints, and multiplies its force when resistance is rigid. So instead of challenging the storm, Viking builders planned to confuse it. They shaped their houses long and low, stretched horizontally across the land like something crouching. This shape mattered more than decoration ever could. Wind striking a tall wall hits with violence. Wind flowing over a curved, sloping roof loses power, its energy pulled upward and away. The house did not say "You shall not pass." It whispered, "Go around." Even the direction the house faced was chosen carefully. Entrances were rarely pointed toward prevailing winds. Doors were weaknesses, everyone knew this. Cold air rushed in. Snow drifted through gaps. So doors were tucked into sheltered sides, sometimes protected by small entry passages designed to trap cold before it reached the living space. Step inside, close the door, and the storm was suddenly distant, muted, almost confused. Then came the ground itself. Viking houses were not simply placed on land, they were partially swallowed by it. Floors were dug down below ground level, sometimes by several feet. This did two things at once. First, it reduced the height of the walls exposed to wind. Second, it tapped into the Earth's natural insulation. Below the surface, temperatures change slowly. Cold arrives late. Heat lingers. By sinking the living space into the ground, the Vikings turned the land into a silent ally. But digging into earth introduces danger. Water collects. Cold seeps upward. Rot becomes a threat. Once again, the Vikings did not ignore these risks, they engineered around them. Drainage channels were carved carefully, guiding water away from the house. Floors were layered, packed earth, stone, sometimes wooden planks raised just enough to keep dampness from stealing heat. Nothing was left to chance. And still, the most radical choice remained. No nails. This decision was not romantic tradition. It was hard-earned wisdom. Nails concentrate stress. When wind flexes a structure, nails resist movement until suddenly they don't. Then they snap, or pull free, leaving behind invisible weaknesses that grow with every storm. Viking builders understood something modern construction often forgets: strength is not stiffness. Strength is controlled movement. So instead of nails, they carved joints that locked together like puzzle pieces. Mortise and tenon. Interlocking beams. Notches shaped to tighten under pressure. When the wind pushed against the walls, these joints did not loosen, they pressed harder against each other. The house became stronger because of the storm. This was architecture designed to thrive under attack. The roof, however, was where storms usually won. Snow crushed. Rain rotted. Wind tore coverings away. The Vikings responded with what might be their most misunderstood innovation: turf roofs. Layer upon layer of birch bark, sod, and earth was laid across wooden beams. To the untrained eye, it looked crude, like grass dumped on top of a hut. In reality, it was a masterpiece of thermal engineering. Birch bark repelled water. Sod added massive weight, anchoring the roof against wind. The soil trapped air, forming insulation so effective that heat from the fire below was held like breath inside lungs. The roof did not fear snow. It welcomed it. Snow added insulation, pressing the turf down tighter, sealing gaps. Where other roofs collapsed under winter's weight, Viking roofs grew stronger. Inside, the house was dim, smoky, and alive with heat. Fires burned continuously, their warmth absorbed by stone and earth, radiating long after flames died down. Smoke drifted upward and escaped through roof openings, not chimneys, but controlled gaps that allowed airflow without inviting the storm inside. Smoke preserved wood, deterred insects, and added another invisible layer of defense. Everything served multiple purposes. Nothing was wasted. Yet what truly separates Viking stormproof houses from ordinary shelters is not any single technique. It is the mindset behind them. These builders did not believe the storm could be conquered. They believed it could be understood. That belief changed everything. Each winter tested their theories. Each survival confirmed them. Children grew up inside structures that barely moved while the world outside raged. They learned, without being taught, that safety came from respecting forces larger than themselves. That arrogance killed. Observation saved. And slowly, something remarkable happened. The storm stopped feeling random. Patterns emerged. Winds favored certain paths, snow gathered predictably. Weaknesses appeared in the same places, again and again. Viking builders refined their methods with almost scientific precision, generation after generation, until their houses were no longer experiments but proven answers to a hostile world. By now, the question has changed. It is no longer how they built these houses without nails or cement. It is why we stopped building like this at all. Because what the Vikings created was not just shelter. It was a philosophy of survival, one that treated nature not as something to dominate, but as something to work with, listen to, and ultimately endure. And in the next part of this story, we will confront the most dangerous enemy these houses were built to defeat: not wind, not rain, not snow, but time itself. Storms are loud. Winter is cruel. But time is patient and far more destructive. A house can survive one great storm by luck. It can survive a harsh winter by chance. But only something designed with deep understanding can survive decades of wind, moisture, shifting earth, and human life pressing against it day after day. The Vikings were not building for a single season. They were building for children not yet born. And time was the enemy they feared most. Wood rots. Stone cracks. Earth settles. Even the strongest materials eventually fail if they are forced to stay rigid while the world moves beneath them. The Vikings learned this lesson early, and they learned it painfully. Houses that seemed strong in their first years slowly twisted, sagged, and split. Walls leaned. Roofs sank. Small failures became fatal ones. And so the question changed again: how do you build something that grows old without falling apart? The answer was not stronger materials. It was forgiveness. Viking houses were designed to forgive movement, moisture, and age. Their structures expected change. Beams were not locked into fixed positions forever, they were meant to settle, shift, and tighten over time. As wood dried, joints closed more firmly. As earth compressed under the house's weight, walls found new equilibrium. What looked like decay to an outsider was often the house adjusting itself into greater stability. This is why nails and cement had no place here. Cement cracks when the ground moves. Nails tear wood fibers as they rust and expand. These materials fight change and lose. Viking joinery, by contrast, accepted it. Movement was not a flaw. It was part of the design. Even repairs were anticipated. Roofs were built in layers that could be replaced without dismantling the entire structure. Turf could be lifted and renewed. Rotten beams could be swapped out individually because the house did not depend on a single rigid skeleton. It was modular in a way that feels startlingly modern. A family could maintain the same home for generations, not by freezing it in time, but by allowing it to evolve. The earth walls told the same story. Stone was stacked, not cemented. Earth packed, not poured. This meant that when frost heaved the ground or rain shifted soil, the walls absorbed the movement instead of shattering. Small gaps formed and then closed again under weight. The house breathed with the seasons. Expansion in summer. Contraction in winter. Year after year. Inside, life itself contributed to durability. Heat dried moisture. Smoke preserved timber. Human presence, constant movement, repair, awareness kept the house alive. A Viking home was never abandoned to fend for itself. Neglect was the true danger. A lived-in house was a strong house. And then there was fire. Fire was both friend and threat. It warmed, cooked, preserved. It also consumed everything if allowed to escape control. Viking houses balanced this danger with brutal simplicity. Fires were central, open, and always visible. There was no illusion of safety. Everyone knew where the danger lived. Smoke blackened ceilings, hardened wood surfaces, and warned occupants of airflow changes. If something went wrong, it was seen, smelled, felt immediately. Nothing was hidden. This honesty extended beyond construction into psychology. Living in a house that clearly responded to weather taught its inhabitants constant awareness. They felt the wind through subtle vibrations. They heard the roof settle under snow. They noticed changes before disaster struck. The house spoke and they listened. This relationship between people and shelter is something we have almost entirely lost. Modern buildings promise invincibility. Thick walls, sealed windows, artificial climate. We are separated from the environment until something catastrophic happens, until the power fails, the roof collapses, the flood overwhelms defenses. Viking houses offered no such illusion. They did not pretend the storm was gone. They simply made it survivable. And time respected that. Archaeologists have uncovered foundations of Viking houses that lasted hundreds of years in some of the harshest climates on Earth. Not because they were indestructible but because they were adaptable. When one part weakened, the rest compensated. When materials aged, they did so gracefully. This is the quiet genius of Viking stormproof houses. They were not monuments. They were systems. Systems designed to outlive their builders. But there is a darker side to this story, one rarely discussed. These houses did not just protect bodies. They shaped minds. Children raised inside these structures grew up with a deep, instinctive understanding of cause and effect. They learned that survival came from preparation, patience, and respect for forces beyond control. This mindset did not stay inside the house. It traveled with them onto ships, into unknown seas, across hostile lands. The same principles that kept their homes standing kept their people alive in places others could not endure. And in the next section, we will confront the most unsettling realization of all, that Viking stormproof houses were not just responses to nature but training grounds that forged a culture capable of surviving almost anything. A Viking house did more than keep out the storm. It shaped the people inside it. From the moment a child took their first steps on a packed earth floor, they were being trained without words, without lessons to understand survival. The house taught them silently. When the wind howled, the walls hummed instead of cracking. When snow piled high, the roof pressed downward but did not give way. The child learned that strength did not mean violence. It meant endurance, flexibility, preparation. These homes were classrooms built from necessity. Life inside a Viking house was communal and exposed. There were no private rooms, no hidden corners where danger could grow unnoticed. Everyone slept, ate, worked, and endured together. When storms trapped families inside for days, sometimes weeks, the house became the entire universe. And in that confined space, every design choice revealed its purpose. The fire sat at the center, not hidden away. Warmth was shared equally. Smoke drifted through the space, reminding everyone that comfort carried cost. Someone always tended the fire. Someone always watched the roof beams. Maintenance was not optional, it was survival. A loose turf layer ignored today could mean collapse tomorrow. This constant awareness created a culture of responsibility. You did not trust the house blindly. You participated in it. You listened to it. You repaired it. In return, it protected you. This relationship blurred the line between shelter and companion. The house was not an object. It was a living system that demanded respect. And this mentality extended outward. A people who built homes that endured storms did not panic when storms came. While others fled or prayed, Vikings prepared. They stored food in ways that resisted moisture and rot. They organized tools where they could be reached even in darkness. They understood that chaos favored the unready. The house was the first place this philosophy took root. It is impossible to separate Viking expansion, resilience, and adaptability from the homes that raised them. A child who grew up watching a roof survive a blizzard learns something powerful: the world could be hostile and still survivable. But this strength had limits. Because no house, no matter how well built, could protect against every threat. And as Viking communities grew, their houses faced pressures they were never meant to endure alone. This is where the Stormproof house reveals its greatest vulnerability. Section 5, When Nature Changed the Rules. The Vikings built for the storms they knew. They did not build for the storms that were coming. Over time, climates shifted. Winters grew harsher in some regions, wetter in others. Forests were cut faster than they could recover. Soil eroded. Good building land became scarce. Houses that once stood perfectly positioned now faced rising water, unstable ground, or relentless wind with no natural shelter left. The old designs still worked, but they were pushed closer to their limits. Communities responded the only way they knew how: adaptation. Houses grew thicker walls. Roofs grew heavier. Some homes sank deeper into the earth. Others clustered together, sharing protection, forming early villages where structures shielded one another from wind. But adaptation requires balance. Too much weight on a roof risked collapse. Dig too deep and flooding became inevitable. Remove too many trees and wind had free passage. Slowly, almost invisibly, the delicate relationship between house, land, and climate began to strain. And then came time's cruelest weapon: abandonment. When a house is lived in, it survives. When it is left alone, it dies quickly. Turf dries out. Roofs crack. Water finds pathways. Once people moved on, whether to raid, trade, or settle elsewhere, the house lost its guardian. Many of the legendary Stormproof houses did not fail because their designs were flawed. They failed because the people who understood them were gone. Knowledge, more than material, was the true foundation. As generations passed and new materials appeared, iron nails, imported stone, later cement, the old methods began to fade. Faster construction replaced patient building. Convenience replaced understanding. Houses were built to stand still, not to move. At first, this felt like progress. Until storms reminded humanity the rules had never changed. Section 6, The Forgotten Lesson Beneath Our Feet. Today, we marvel at Viking stormproof houses as ancient wonders. We treat them like clever tricks from a simpler time. But this story is not really about Vikings. It is about us. Modern buildings rise quickly, proudly, rigidly. They resist wind until they shatter. They trap heat artificially while ignoring natural insulation. They separate us from weather so completely that we forget how powerful it truly is until disaster arrives. The Vikings never forgot. Their houses whispered warnings long before collapse. They creaked, shifted, breathed. They demanded attention. They rewarded care. They punished neglect. They reminded their inhabitants daily that survival was an active process. What is unsettling is not that these houses worked. What is unsettling is that, in many ways, they still work better than what replaced them. Across cold regions today, builders are rediscovering techniques the Vikings mastered centuries ago: earth insulation, flexible joinery, low-profile designs, passive heating. What we call innovative is often ancient wisdom returning under new names. The storm never changed. Only our memory did. And as the wind continues to rise, as climates grow more violent and unpredictable, one question echoes louder than ever, one the Vikings answered long ago with wood, earth, and patience. When the storm comes, will your house fight it? Or will it survive it? And that question, once asked, never truly goes away. Long after the last hammerless joint was carved, long after the hands that built it turned to dust, the house remained. This is the part of the story that feels almost unsettling because it defies how we think about age, decay, and progress. While empires rose and fell, while religions replaced one another, while tools evolved and languages shifted, some Viking houses simply endured. Not untouched. Not perfect. But standing. Breathing. Waiting. Archaeologists would later find their bones pressed into the earth, post holes aligned with frightening precision, stone footings still locked together, floor levels worn smooth by centuries of footsteps. These were not ruins caused by sudden destruction. They were remains of structures that had lived full lives. What kept them alive was not magic. It was intention. Every Viking house was built with the assumption that it would be challenged again and again. Not just by storms but by time, neglect, scarcity, and change. Nothing about it relied on permanence. And that is precisely why it lasted. Where modern buildings demand constant external support, repairs requiring specialized materials, tools, and expertise, Viking houses could be healed by the same hands that lived inside them. Knowledge was local. Materials were nearby. Repair was not a crisis, it was routine. A damaged roof did not mean failure. It meant work. This is why some houses seem to refuse to die. Even when partially abandoned, they decayed slowly. Turf roofs slumped but did not collapse. Walls leaned but stayed connected. The house resisted sudden death. It aged the way living things age, gradually, visibly, honestly. And here is the most disturbing realization of all. The Vikings did not build these houses to impress the future. They built them to be forgotten. A good house did not demand attention. It did not announce its brilliance. It simply did its job, year after year, storm after storm, without celebration. Its success was silence. Its victory was survival. This is why history nearly missed their genius. We remember Viking ships because they traveled far. We remember weapons because they spilled blood. But houses? Houses stayed where they were. They did not conquer. They endured. And endurance does not shout, it whispers. Yet those whispers are growing louder now. As modern societies face storms stronger than expected, winters harsher than predicted, and climates no longer following familiar rules, the Viking house begins to feel less like a relic and more like a warning left behind. It tells us something uncomfortable. That survival was once designed into daily life, not outsourced to technology. That people once built with humility instead of arrogance. That strength once meant harmony with the land, not domination of it. The Viking house did not refuse to die out of stubbornness. It refused because it was never meant to be finished. It was meant to be lived in, repaired, adapted, and eventually returned to the earth without violence. No collapse. No catastrophe. Just a slow, respectful fading like footprints in snow. And as the story reaches its end, one final truth remains, heavier than stone and quieter than wind. The Vikings did not defeat the storm. They learned to live beneath it. And the question they leave behind carved into soil, wood, and memory is not about the past at all. It is about whether we are wise enough to listen.